showing themselves as pretty excellent. Okay, good evening, everyone, both live and on screen. Actually, just before I go further, for those who have joined on screen, I'll just post again in the chat, and I'll put on the YouTube link also at the bottom the link to the handout, so people have the handout. What I wanted to look at was a small episode in this week's Satra, and I really enjoyed preparing this year. I think it's a very interesting topic. The incident when Klal Yisrael leave Egypt, this week's Parsha, Parsha Rabbi, and they are instructed by Moshe, by Moshe, based on the instruction of Hashem, to borrow from the Egyptians gold and silver vessels and take them out of Egypt. And this loot, of course, they ended up keeping forever. And there's a number of moral, textual, and historical questions about this incident. Textually, many of the words are quite difficult to translate in this Parsha. Morally, there's many questions about this sort of trick that they played on the Egyptians, in which they asked to borrow and then ended up keeping the treasure that they took. And historically, it's actually unclear when this event took place. Did it take place on the night of departure, between midnight and dawn, when, as we emphasize in Haggadah, they left Chipazon in a rush and didn't even have time to prepare their supplies? They took dough that became matzahs. Did they yet nonetheless have time to loot? Okay, sometimes there's time to get money, there isn't time to bake your provisions. Or if you read the Psukim in order, arguably it took place before Makas Bechoros, before the final plague, in which case it's a remarkable incident, because they're going to the Egyptians and saying, give us money, we're planning to leave, before the Egyptians have even agreed to them to leave. A really interesting incident. So there's a number, and we're not going to be able to resolve everything tonight, but beyond what I'm discussing here in Shir, it's definitely worth having a look at the Psukim at your own leisure, and trying to understand what's going on in this little episode. So let's learn the Psukim and see what emerges. Pasuk, source 1 at the top of page 1. This is right at the beginning, by the way, before anything, when Moshe is still being given his shlichus, his agency. Hashem says to him the end game. The end game will be that they will leave Egypt and they'll leave with wealth. That's the prediction Hashem gives. And again, I'll just post in the chat for those who have joined the link, for those who don't have the handout. So Hashem tells them that I've just done here. Okay, that's gone. So Hashem tells them that they'll loot. Let's look at Psukim. Pasuk Kafalef, Pasuk. I see in English. I didn't put 21 in bold. I think Pasuk 21. I'll put the people's favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. They won't leave empty-handed. Each, in the Hebrew I put this in bold, probably I should have done it in English also. Each woman shall borrow from her neighbor. Interesting, this is a woman's task. Women do this. And umigarat beisa, and for those that dwell in a house, silver and gold objects and garments. Sometimes your children will carry them. V'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim, and you will nitzaltem Mitzrayim. Very difficult word to translate. Rashi says v'nitzaltem, I printed the Rashi here, means you shall empty out, and he sees it from a root of emptying out. In modern Hebrew, lenatzel means to take advantage. Lenatzel means to take advantage, or maybe it's nitzaltem, maybe the root is hatzalah, right? We're all aware of the organization hatzalah. Hatzalah means to rescue. So does this mean you should rescue Egypt? You should empty out Egypt? In fact, v'nitzaltem doesn't mean you shall empty out, or what's even the grammatical form of this? Not an easy word to translate. Okay, source 2 is, so this is all the prediction when Hashem says at the end game will be they will leave Egypt and they will empty out Egypt. The dweller in her house, not clear by the way, sorry, I should have mentioned, yeah, the dweller in her house, who this is. It may mean the resident and the sojourner. So you have neighbors who are permanent neighbors in the area and sojourners in their house. But again, it's it's very unclear. And we'll get back to a little bit, to a degree, we'll discuss this language. Pasuk, source 2, this is now Moshe, this is now Hashem instructing Moshe to do the agency. Daber no, speak no, ba'oznei ha'om, in the ears of the people. V'yishlu ish me'es re'eu, v'isha me'es re'uta. Each man, here now men are involved, should ask from their friends, v'isha me'es re'uta, and each woman from her friends, kli kesef v'kli zav, gold and silver utensils. So here again, there's a number of interesting features. First of all, it's no longer the neighbors that are being asked, but it's the friends who are being asked. And this language of daber no, not even clear how to translate that. No is added for emphasis. It's an emphasis word. It's probably actually pretty similar to sort of, it may be similar to nu, the Yiddish nu. Daber no might mean ask now, and it's like emphatic, definitely ask, or it might mean daber no, like please ask, I request of you to ask. And if we miss out Rashi in the grey box for a second and just carry on, Pasuk 3, Vayitin Hashem, I see I have the name Yud Vavke here, so please don't chuck out these sources if you printed it, they need to go and shame us. Vayitin Hashem, Eschein Ha'am, Be'enim Mitzrayim, Hashem put the favor of the people in the eyes of the Egyptians. Gama Ish Moshe Godel Ma'od Be'eretz Mitzrayim. And the man Moshe was great in the lands of Egypt, but in the eyes of the people, in the eyes of the servants of Paro. So this is also very interesting pasuk. Here it says that the people found favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, number one. And number two, for some reason, the continuation of the pasuk is that Moshe was esteemed greatly. And again, the sequence of psukim is a little bit difficult to understand. Somehow the act or the consequence or the coincidence of asking for the Egyptians, borrowing off the Egyptians' wealth, was also paralleled by Moshe becoming great in their eyes. And famously, correlation is not the same as causation. Is there a link between these two events, or just two events that happen at the same time? But they borrow, and also Moshe becomes greatly esteemed. Finally, in terms of the initial sources, we have a medrash cited by Rashi, and this is in the grey box in source 2. Rashi understands daber no as please ask, a request. And Rashi says Hashem is pleading with Moshe, please ask the Jewish people to go and ask for this wealth, indicating there's some reluctance to do so, number one. If I say please do something, it indicates that you're not so comfortable with doing it. Number two, Hashem wants this to happen. So it's not just a favor for the Jewish people, but Hashem has an interest in this happening. Why would Hashem have an interest in this happening? Says the Medrash, Rashi, famously, that if we look, as we will in a moment, in source 3, we see that the exile in Egypt is predicted. It's part of a unique covenant made between Hashem and Avram. And we've spoken about covenants before, we're not going to speak about them now, but I pointed out then that covenants aren't always soft and fluffy and pleasant. Covenants can be quite tough, the Torah and the like. The Bris Ben Avsarim is such a covenant. It's a covenant with Avram. It's a deal of sorts between Hashem and Avram. And the deal is, though, a tough one, that the Jews will go into exile and they will be enslaved. And we know these psukim from Haggadah, they'll eventually emerge with great wealth. So Hashem is saying to the people, please make sure you take wealth, because otherwise Avram will have complaints against me. You kept part of the covenant and not other parts of the covenant. You filled Mahadrin min Mahadrin, you fulfilled the mitzvah, the covenant of enslaving them, but you didn't fulfill the granting of treasure to them. Again, a bit of an interesting idea. What's this complaint that Hashem is worried about? That you gave them slavery, but you didn't give them kush. But that's what Rashi says in the Medrash. So please ask them. Okay, so far, just to summarize, what we've seen is a number of difficulties in the pasuk. We've seen both a prediction at the beginning and an actualization at the end of the Jewish people being told to borrow. We've seen that this is effective. We've seen slight differences between the original prediction that they'll borrow from their neighbors, eventually they'll borrow from their friends. And we've seen Moshe somehow becoming very esteemed, and we've seen that there's some reluctance on the part of the Bnei Yisrael, of the Israelites, to request from the Egyptians wealth, and they feel a bit of a discomfort with it. And we don't need to read this inside. Source 3 is the famous Bris Ben Avsarim, the covenant. Let's just look at English. Hashem said to Avram, "You should surely know that your seed will be strangers, the land's not there. They will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years." Pasuk 14. But after that, I will judge the nation that persecutes them, and they'll go through great possessions. Okay, so this is the introductory sources. Now, before we go further, I want to focus I want to spend quite a bit of time looking at the moral question over here, because there's no getting away from the fact, seemingly, that the instruction to the Jewish people is to do something that's a little bit dubious. And maybe this is the source of their reluctance. They're told to go to the Egyptians' neighbors and borrow gold and silver. Now, we know the end of the story, that this is not going to be a borrowing. This is going to be a gift. I mean, they're going to end up with this permanently in their possession. So how are we meant to understand that? And
at this point, did the Egyptians think they were only going out for 3 days? Because then the borrowing would make sense in that.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. What do the Egyptians think? Do they think they're only going out for 3 days? I don't want to go into detail because it depends on the reading of the psukim. It depends what the timing is. It depends on 2 questions. It depends when this is happening. Is it happening before or after Makas Bachoros? And it also depends how widely diffused the knowledge of the conversations between Moshe and Paro are amongst the Egyptian populace. Because don't forget, here they're going to borrow from the masses. Moshe is speaking to Paro. To what degree did the population know what was going on in the diplomatic negotiations in the palace? Did they even understand? How much did they understand about the Makkahs? Did people realize? Moshe goes and warns Paro the Makkahs are happening. And the Mepharshim speak about this all in this Parsha, in this topic over here, but really it's questions over the whole last few Sedras. Do the people even know what's going on? What does the average Egyptian understand about all of these events? And are they even aware that this is a correlation between the Jewish people and others? There's a lot of very profound questions here on these parshas. So where do we go with all of this? Now, this question is posed in very classic sources, and the first source we'll have a look at is source 5 at the end of page 1, and it goes on to page 2. And this is a Gemara in Sanhedrin. And the Gemara brings a story, maybe I'll read this outside, I won't read it inside just in the interest of time. The Gemara brings a story in which the Egyptians summon the Jewish people to the International Court of Human Rights, as it were, in, where is it, in Brussels? Where's the International Court of Human Rights? In The Hague, sorry, in The Hague, yes. So the Egyptians summon the Jews to The Hague of the ancient world. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered the ancient world, and he now is a ruler over many disparate people. And then God brings a whole series of rulings of international court cases that Alexander engages in. And in one of the trials, the Egyptians summon the Jewish people, and they say, you are thieves, you owe us reparations of vast sums of money because you looted our land of its treasures. And the Gemara brings that there was a figure that we don't know much about called Gvir ben Sisa. We don't know much about him. And he says to the Chachomim, I'm a simple man. Let me respond. If I respond badly, there's not too much egg on your face because you'll say, who was this idiot? He's a nobody. He's not a famous figure. He's not anyone. And you can always backpedal. And if I succeed, then great. Then you've won the argument and there's nothing else to do. So what is his response? He says to the Egyptians, fine, you want to quote our Tanakh. This is, Ben Gurion waving his Tanakh in the UN. You want to quote our Tanakh, I'll quote the Tanakh back. What does the Torah tell us? It says that the Jews worked for you for 430 years. Now, we know there's questions around the dating and the timings. This is what he says. Let's do a quick calculation of 600,000 people working for 430 years and try and come up with a back of the envelope guesstimate as to what sum of money you owe us, and then let's work out how much 600,000 people loading stuff on their children could have possibly looted, and you tell me if the sums match up. And the Egyptians left with the tails between their legs. They realized that they were the ones in a mess. So records the Gemara. Now, with all Midrashim and Agadotos, it's hard to know what's literal, what's metaphorical, what's a message, and so on. But this appears to be a Gemara telling a story of an event. What's very interesting is that Josephus records anti-Jewish polemics in the Roman era, in which Egyptians do make such a claim against the Jews. Now, Josephus is not the most reliable figure, and I certainly don't mean to say that, don't worry, it's not just Chazal who said it, it's also Josephus. But in general, Josephus is believed, Josephus is a very interesting figure, but I don't, in this setting, go too much into his history. In general, Josephus has 3 genders, to glorify himself, to glorify the Romans, and to glorify the Jews. Anything that hits those 3 points, we don't believe him about, and anything else he's considered, reasonably reliable on. Unfortunately, between self-glorification and glorification of the Romans and the Jews, That's a considerable package of work, but either way, he's a very important historical source. And he, I'm no expert in Josephus, but he has a book called Appion, in which in volume 1, chapter 26, he cites actually quite a well-known figure, an Egyptian called Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest who accused the Jews in sort of anti-Semitic libels of looting the temple. And he says, you always did this, you always were looters. And back in the day, you looted Egypt, and you tricked us and claimed you were borrowing and walked off under false pretenses. So it's very, very interesting to know that there's sort of different sources referencing some sort of equivalent claim against the Jews. We look back on the Torah as sort of, but they were looking back on it, and this was very real, lived Egyptian Jewish experience based on the Gemara and Josephus.
Today, you say there's no real archaeological evidence for the whole Exodus thing. So there was a tradition.
At least Josephus records Egyptians taking this claim and the Gemara records Egyptians taking it very seriously. Did they only know it from the Torah? Is it disingenuous? Is it real? What's the claim? Who knows? We don't. These things are lost in the midst of time. But so good thing. So what's the Gemara's answer to the moral justification for this? Wages. Right? It's wages. We, by the way, have in the sense a similar idea when a slave goes free with the Evedivri. The Evedivri goes free, and there's a mitzvah, Parsha Mishpatim, not that far off, a couple of weeks off. Hanokah, there's an idea of granting a gift to the Evedivri goes free, and this is Hanokah of sorts. The Rishonim, by the way, point out that the people doing the paying over here are the common man. It says, "Vayishalu Ishmei Re'ehu." Each person asks their neighbor. They ask their friends. So if they're asking their shecheno Re'ehu, it means they're asking private citizens, which seems to suggest that private citizens owe them money for their years of servitude. Why would private citizens owe them money for the years of servitude? Either because they're members of the state, it's a national debt which has to be paid by individuals, or because individuals also enslaved the Jewish people. Who knows? Again, they're not entirely clear, but it's interesting that the individuals seem to be being approached to compensate the Jews. So we're going to get to that. Does Re'ehu mean friendship? In which case, maybe it's a completely different reading of the Pesukim. But for now, Shechena Re'ehu seems to be an individual thing, but we will indeed get to your point. Okay, so this is the Gemara's answer. Source 4, I went out of order over here, so we go back to the bottom, page 1, is a Rashi. In the interest of time, again, maybe we'll just glance very briefly at Rashi. Rashi picks up on a textual problem. Basically, Pasuk Lamed Vav, Pasuk 36 says, "V'Hashem nosan eschein ha'om be'einei Mitzrayim." Hashem put so we're here on the bottom page 1, gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians. Vayashilum, and they, in the English it says they lent them. It's causative, so it means they caused them to borrow. Now this is a very interesting turn of phrase. If I approach and say, Simon, when you lend me some money, and you lend me, it wouldn't normally be your action wouldn't normally be in the causative. You caused me to borrow. You didn't cause me to borrow. I caused myself to borrow. You very kindly lent me. So the language of caused to borrow is an interesting terminology. Rashi, who is sensitive, of course, to every nuance of language, picks this up. Says Rashi, "Vayashinam," they lent them. Afmash, says Rashi, and they lent them. Afmash even that which they didn't ask of them, they lent them. So again, in our example, I go to Simon and I say, "Would you lend me 100?" And you say, "I'll lend you 1,000," right? So Vayashinum, you cause me to borrow. In other words, Rashi says they gave them more than they asked for. So the Jews came to the Egyptians and said, "Can you lend me one, gold becher?" And the Egyptians say, "Take 5, right? Take as many as you want." Why? Because Hashem gave the favor of the people. So Rashi says this as a textual point, but we can certainly suggest this as a second answer to our question, which is it's true that initially they went and borrowed, but the Egyptians said, keep it, take more than you even want, and gave them more. So perhaps we can suggest. Okay, so these are two responses to the moral question. Let's look at a third response, and this is from the Ibn Ezra, really fascinating comment. And the Ibn Ezra here is on the top of page 2, source 6. And again, I'll just summarize the Ibn Ezra outside. And the Ibn Ezra basically says, this whole question is ridiculous. Don't ask questions on God. God owns the world. He can do what he wants. He grants wealth to nations and he transfers net wealth to nations. Were we humans to have made this decision, of course it would be immoral. But if Hashem is telling us to do it, the morality question doesn't come into the question. There's nothing to talk about over here. So says the Ibn Ezra. He says this comment in very brief in the standard Ibn Ezra, as printed in our Mikros Gedolos. I'm lucky enough to have the Baranan database. In the Baranan database, they have Ibn Ezra Aruch, which isn't printed in the standard Moshe. I think it's printed in one of the sets that we have here, and the Machon Yerushalayim set or something like that. And this is an extended commentary of the Ibn Ezra, in which the Ibn Ezra basically wrote two commentaries in the Torah, a shortened version and an extended version. And the extended version, he makes it much more explicit. And let's just have a quick look at what he says. Vinit Sultem, and they emptied out or looted. Let's come over Yatzal. Let's leave that for the moment. Hakol mitam hatzolah. The Ibn Ezra says this is saving, but because of the violence that was done against them. So this is reparations of sorts, perhaps in line with the Gemara, except not for the work, but for the violence. And then he says, "V'yesh misonanim the omim." There are those who say, those who complain, and they say, "Ki aviseinu gamavim hayu." Our ancestors were thieves. So it seems this is a sort of topical question in Ibn Ezra's time. People are saying, look, this is an embarrassment. Our ancestors are thieves. The Eila haloyu kimitzvah elyon ha'isa. Surely these people can see that this is an instruction from the Elyon, from the one on high. The intam lishon loma. How can you ask why on Hashem? Ki Hashem bar hakol. God created everything. He can take wealth from those he wishes and give it to those who he wishes to give it to. A bit analogous, by the way, to Rashi's comment at the beginning of the Torah, a famous Rashi, which we're not going to go into now. Rashi asks, why does the Torah start with gracious? It should have started, the Torah is a book of instruction, it should have started with this week's Zedra Chodesh Zedachem. And Rashi answers to tell us that God owns everything, so that if we have ethical problems about how can the Jews conquer the land of Canaan, God gave the land to the Canaanites, he took it away from the Canaanites, gave it to us. God is the owner of the universe. He's entitled to redistribute as he wishes. So says the Ibn Ezra. So this is the Ibn Ezra's approach. No moral question at all. The Netziv and various others say that they're entitled to take as loot. And basically, let's have a quick read of the Netziv. The Netziv is Naftali Yehuda Berlin, the Rosh Hashiva of 1800s, Rosh Hashiva of Volozhin. Vayishalu shekol Mitzrayim lo yodu machshavas pariv dvarav l'Moshe. And this is in direct response to. I think David, you made this comment. You asked, who asked about? Did they know about 3 days? You asked, yeah. So here he says that the common man didn't know about the conversations. The later conversations in which Moshe had switched his claim to permanent leaving, and they thought it was still 3 days, because in the negotiations things shift, and they thought they're still going back to Egypt. And then he carries on. Mishum Hochi, the second line of the Netziv in Source 7, Lo Hoya Hishinim, they lent them, there's no trace of immorality in this. Hashem could have told them to loot, and Hashem wanted to engineer that they will pursue after Israel, and so on and so forth. So basically, he says, and then he carries on, we can't ultimately investigate the minds of God. So basically, the Netziv is going somewhat in line with Ibn Ezra, and he says Hashem could have told them to take. They're entitled to loot the Egyptians at this point in their history. But he wants the common people to pressure Paro to chase after them, and therefore this is all part of the Yitzias Mitzrayim plan. The Siphonos sort of carries on, and he says as follows. He says the original intention of the Jewish people maybe was to borrow, but don't forget that afterwards they chased after us, and they got defeated in the Yam Suf. Now the law in international law of the time, and Torah law recognizes this, is that if you win a war and there's spoils, you're allowed to take the spoils. I mean, that's what we see happens with Moav in the desert and various other battles. They thought you're allowed to take spoils. So Sophonik sort of carries on the Ibn Ezra's thoughts, and he says that don't forget the Egyptians chased after them. There's a battle that occurs, and they're allowed to take loot at the Yam Suf because now they've wiped out the Egyptians. And this is how the Ibn Ezra understands this. Like happens with later on with Milchemes Midian and other scenarios in history. Okay, so just to summarize what we've said so far, We've seen Rashi, who suggests that they voluntarily give more. We've seen the Gemara that looks on this as wages. We've seen the Ibn Ezra, who looks on this as reparations for cruelty, and also says don't ask of God. We've seen the Netziv, who says they were entitled to loot. We've seen the Safana, who says that this is booty originally they borrowed and they only kept it after the Egyptians broke their word and chased after them in the Yam Suf. I'll maybe mention just two other sources, and then we'll look at a completely different approach. The Akedas Yitzchok, who is a philosophical Rishon, and the Malbim, who is a commentary from the 1800s, 1809 to 1870 something, to 1879, I think he lived till 70, Rameya, Leibish, Yehuda, Malbim, the Malbim. He was a genius, by the way. If you look at his commentary, it's very, very clear that he was a staggering genius. He was a Rav in Germany, in Russia, in Romania, had a very varied career. They both suggest that what was going on over here was exchange. So unfortunately, we're familiar in recent times with Jews having to run away as refugees, both from Germany in the 1930s, from North Africa in the 1940s. And they leave behind their homes, and from Poland, of course, East Europe, they leave behind their homes, they leave behind furniture, they leave behind animals and livestock and wealth. And who moves in? The neighbors. And this, he says, is why they go to Shecheneim, their neighbors. And they say to their neighbors, look, we're moving out. You're going to get our housing. You're going to get our property. Pay us in portables. Pay us in mobile cash. Give us gold and silver, and that way we can leave. And therefore, this is the justification for them taking. This is payment for in exchange for houses and furniture and other things that were immobile, like happens whenever there's refugees. So says the Akedas Yitzchok and the Malbim. Okay, so far we've had varied responses that accept the moral dilemma over here and give various solutions. What I printed over here, but maybe in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through in too much detail inside, but I will leave it to you to read, is the thought of Rav Hirsch. And Rav Hirsch says a terrible travesty of mistranslation has occurred, because the word she'ela there are two similar words that mean very different ideas. She'ela can mean borrowing, and she'ela can mean asking. And we've mistranslated all these psukim, because the pasuk doesn't say they went to borrow off their Egyptian neighbors and friends. The pasuk said they went to ask off their Egyptian neighbors and friends. What do they ask? They asked to be given. And what's going on here is to be given, not to ask. He says a grammatical point for those who are interested in grammar. And he says that when it means borrow, the language is she'ela me'im, borrowing from with. In other words, I'm not taking away from the person, I'm taking away from it being with the person. It's still owned by them, but it's no longer with them because I'm borrowing it temporarily. So that is she'ela me'im. And if you are asking from someone, then it's she'ela me'et, for asking of the person. So sometimes when I ask something of you, I'm taking it away from you. It's she'ela me'et, it's asking from you. And sometimes it's asking from with you. That it should no longer be with you. I'm borrowing that it should be now with me. Now, were I to say that, you would question my knowledge of Tanakh. Rav Hirsch says that this phraseology occurs a few hundred times in Nach, and he has done an exhaustive study of it, and he believes this rule holds true in every instance, that even though these are two similar verbs, they mean two different things. There is she'ela from and she'ela from with, and never the twain shall meet. We shouldn't confuse the two. And by the way, Rav Hirsch had, this isn't known, but Samson Raphael Hirsch had an absolutely encyclopedic memory, and was he was a genius. And we know this from many sources, including a response, a scathing response he wrote to Gretz at the time that he wrote an article. And we know from the dating and the records that he wrote this response in less than 3 days. And in it, he shows a towering mastery of all Jewish sources. And it's staggering to think, even if someone had the research tools available nowadays of Baralano, Chochmah, the various online databases that are available, it'd be a superhuman ability to write a response. And in this article that he wrote, he quotes hundreds of sources, literally, and to the duff, in others, he references lines of Gemara and pages and sources. And we happen to know this one particular article, how long it took to write him. So he has a vast literary output, most of which we don't know how long it took to write him. It's clear from this, with this one dated article, that he has a mind that was capable of scanning material incredibly. And this is Rav Hirsch's point. Incidentally, by the way, in source 12 on page 3, I brought the Rashbam, and the Rashbam says the same thing. The Rashbam clearly translated the passage. The Rashbam is back to the era of the Rishonim, a grandson of Rashi, a master of Peshat, and it's very clear he doesn't belabor the point. It's very clear that he understands that the phraseology of she'ela means to ask, not to borrow. That's very clear. He says, "V'sha'ala isha meshchenta b'matana gemara." They asked as a permanent gift. So he says the whole thing is a mistake. This is a request for a gift. This was never a request for borrowing at all.
According to
correct, yes. Mayim from with, yes. That's correct, yes. Whereas if it says may or mayet, from or from thing with the name, then that's a thing. And he claims that there's several hundred examples in Tanakh, and they all fit this pattern. And there's two different routes. For obvious reasons, they're similar. I mean, they're similar concepts, borrowing and asking, but he says they're not identical. The verb can be used in two different ways. So says Hirsch. And the Rashbam, it doesn't belabor the point. He just seems to casually understand it as asking rather than borrowing. Rav Hirsch then comments on the daber no, please ask the Jewish people to ask. And he says this is because there is a reluctance. And he says that the Klal Yisrael are determined to leave biyad Roma with their arms, or nowadays would say, their heads held high. And they want to leave with moral stature. And he says, don't forget, these are the people who during the days of darkness could have looted Egypt had they so chosen to do. And they chose not to do so because they had morals, they had a moral code. And therefore they were reluctant to ask the Egyptians for this money, because they felt in some sense it would be perceived as a blackmail of sorts. It's very nice asking the Egyptians, please give us this stuff. But why are the Egyptians agreeing? Because they're terrified. And therefore they don't want to do it. And this is Hashem's response of daber no, please persuade them to do so. Rav Hirsch, perhaps in line with his Torah Derech Eretz ideology of we need to learn Torah, but we also need to engage in earning our living and engagement with the world and various other things, says, you know why they need money? Because people need money to function. And Hashem tells them to ask the money because they've got to go on and do important things. They're going to go through the midbar, they need to pay for supplies. And maybe we can even view this as a sort of maturation process of the Jewish people, in which Hashem is saying to them, fine, you've been slaves, but it's time now to move on to independence. And yeah, it's a bit uncomfortable for you, but you deserve this money. Go and ask for it because you have it by rights. Yeah.
Very 12 hours ago, drew a more modern parallel. After the war, when the Germans paid reparations, this led to a big dispute among the politicians, like Ben-Gurion and Begin, and Rav Soloveitchik, who said we shouldn't accept reparations, and Rav Henkin said we should. Again, the idea it was sort of demeaning to accept reparations for all the.
Yes, so I'm sorry if this is a repeat. I didn't realize he spoke about this in the share. So since he touched on this, I will turn to source 17, which I printed in page 4. And this is from the Oznaim L'Torah, the Lutsk Rav, the Rav of Lutsk. And we'll just read what he says because he makes his point. And he says, daber no, this is source 17, so I'm jumping ahead just because of your excellent comment. Ein no elalosha makasha. No is request. Makasha zulama. What is this request? Why did they need to be asked? And he says, if we move to the next paragraph, this has puzzled generations, and no one could answer it. And so our era has persuaded it. And this Friday is HMD's Holocaust Memorial Day, Friday the 27th. Therefore, this is an apt point to mention. And he speaks. This is the Oznaim Torah, Rav Sorotskin, writing in the 1940s and early 50s. And he says a debate is raging in Israel as I speak about the moral rights and wrongs of taking reparations from the Germans. And he says that there are those that argue we need to build our state, we need to have finance. Let's take whatever they give. They owe us this money. And others are saying, keep your filthy, blood-ridden money out of our lands. We don't want your loot. We don't want that which is stolen. And he said this is what's going on in the minds of the Jews. The Jew, he writes so beautifully again. There's a time. Please look at these sources afterwards. And he says. The Ksasim Tonim She'ein Lam Yisrael Avei B'Shum Masal Matanim Rasharim Eila V'Lama Yom V'Goyim Shelakachnu Kofen Al Hashem Achinu. Are we going to take bribes and compensation? Can you compensate lives that have been killed? Sheshofkas Domam Kamayim, they spilled our blood like water, and we're now going to take money from them. There's something almost immoral in the idea that you can take money for murder. Like what sorts of business is going on? And that way we can assuage their consciences. He writes on, and the guilt conscience. They feel, we've paid the Jews, it's fine, we can move on in history. We're doing the compensation. And he says there are those that don't want. And he says that we can now understand the tension of the Jews. So Rav Hirsch obviously is writing pre-Holocaust. He doesn't write it quite in those terms. He just says they don't want to use the moral high ground. They don't want to engage in blackmail, and they're not interested in this. And the Oznaim Torah of Zalman Sorotskin extends this idea, and he says there's a real moral dilemma, a real debate going on over here. Who do we really want to take the Egyptians' filthy money? Is that what we want to do? So this is Zalman Sorotskin's reading of this. Just in the interest of completion, so just to move back then in order of what we're saying. Rav Hirsch says that, so just to summarize, Rav Hirsch is arguing that this is not borrowing, this is a mistranslation, it's asking, and he says they're reluctant because they have a moral dignity. They b'nei Yisrael yotzu yad rama, they don't want to leave like thieves in the night, they don't want to be perceived as blackmailing, they have resisted the urge to take in Choshech, they don't want to lose that moral high ground, and therefore they don't want to take. Zalman Sorotskin, as he beautifully points out, extends this idea and says, reparations are not such simple things, such easy things always to take. It's interesting. The pasuk in the Torah seems to call it chein. The motive is chein. And I printed just before source 15 the pasuk in Tehillim, in which it says, "Vayotziem b'kasav zav ve'in v'shot of koshel." They took that. They left with gold and silver, and there was not amongst the tribes michshol koshel, stumbling. So the pasuk seems to be saying there was no moral. A pasuk in Tehillim. I said that the earliest source that's bothered with this question is a Gemara or Josephus, who of course is before the time of Gemara. He's the era of the Mishnah, who talks about the moral claims made against the Jews. Arguably, the pasuk in Tehillim is asking this question, and the pasuk says the aim mishrat of koshel. It's a difficult pasuk to translate, but I mean there is no stumbling amongst Shvatim. What they did was morally right. Somach mitzrayim b'tzeisom. The Egyptians rejoiced when they went out. Ki nofal pachtom aleim. So the pasuk in Shemai says chein, but the pasuk in Tehillim says this is fear. What's the emotion the Egyptians feeling? Are they feeling friendliness to the Jews and this chein, or are they feeling fear of the Jews? Maybe they think we're paying off the Jews or paying off God, and if we give them this compensation, maybe that will bring an end to our suffering and there'll be no more makkahs. So difficult to know how to read them. But if this is what's going on, this is a possible reading of the pasuk that the Tehillim is already saying over here. There's no moral turpitude happening because a nofal pachtom, and therefore they voluntarily gave it. The Cheskuni, by the way, picks up on the point that you made about Re'ehu friendship, and the pasuk that says that. Ish Moshe Godal Ma'od, that Moshe was very great in the eyes of the Egyptians, and he takes seriously the chein. He says by the time the Jews leave, maybe it's a reverse Stockholm syndrome sort of at work, they're looking at the Jews with favor. Maybe they recognize the moral dignity of the Jews, that the Jews aren't looting them. Ish Moshe Godal, they see the greatness and grandeur of Moshe. They see the moral superiority, and they give willingly, as Rashi told us, and therefore it's ish me re'ehu, isha me re'eha. There's a genuine friendship and relationship that's building up over here. So says the Chizkuni in the pasuk. I want to finish off with one more source, which is a sefer called Medrash Chemdat Yomim. Now, the background to the sefer and why I came across it, I will explain. So first of all, even though it's called a medrash, it is not a medrash, it's a commentary. It's a commentary from the 1600s by a Yemenite scholar and Talmid Chacham called Reb Sholem Shavazi. He, as I said, came from 17th century Yemen. He came from a place called Najd al-Walid, I don't know where that is, and then moved to Shabaz, hence his name. And he wrote a commentary on the Torah in which he explains the whole Torah on 4 levels: Peshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. And he called his commentary a medrash. He wrote kinnos, which are still said to this day by the Yemenite community, including kinnot bemoaning the very difficult periods. He was the leader of the Yemenite community when they were in very difficult times. There's a fiction out there that Jews in the Muslim lands had it easier than Jews in the Christian lands. There's some truth to it. There were golden ages and times in which it was wonderful, but there were times when fundamentalism, it's not the first time there's been waves of fundamentalism, and the Jews in Yemen had an absolute miserable time of things on moments. According to Yemenite tradition, he wrote more than 15,000 poems, this man. Even if that's not an accurate number, there's extant 850 of these poems, so very, very prolific poet and author. Anyway, he wrote a sefer called Medrash Chemdat Yomim. How on earth did I come across this? Not my own knowledge, I wish I could claim it, but the incredible Nechama Leibovitz cites this source. And many years ago, I happened to come across a piece that she wrote on this topic, and I cut and pasted the source because I thought one day I would use it, and here I am now using this wonderful source. And he says an incredible and beautiful point. And he says, Loma Nemra, this is source 15, and with this we will finish. Loma mitzvazu Nemra la noshim. Why was this mitzvah said to ladies? Why are the ladies meant to ask of their neighbors? And he answers, Shekivan shegoza paru, there's a typo here, kol haben hayolat hayorat hashlichuhu. As soon as Paru decreed that kol haben hayolat hayorat hashlichuhu, that the children need to be thrown into the river, Yisrael, the daughters of Israel, they bribed the Egyptians to try and save their children. And again, this is a not precursor, almost a predictor of future Jewish history, in which Jews, unfortunately, we have been attacked, and we try and bribe our way out of the problem. Bribes given to the Nazis, bribes given to the Inquisitors. So bribes are given by the mothers. Their jewelry, they take their jewelry off to defend their precious children. And therefore Hashem says to the lady folk, the women folk, the ladies who gave the Egyptian thing, go and ask them for recompense, go and ask them for your money back, for the gold and silver that you enriched the Egyptians by having to bribe to try and save your children. This is the gold and silver that you need to ask back for. So I just want to conclude with, so we've seen basically a range of approaches to this. We've seen questions around the translation of She'elah, the moral question of the wrongs and rights of doing this, asked explicitly by the Gemara, recorded by Josephus as being a challenge, perhaps indicated in Tehillim, the Ein B'Shvat of Koshel, they didn't stumble, and this was not wrong that they did, and different suggestions as to what the moral justification would be: compensation, payment, wages, and so on. And then perhaps the argument that this is a mistranslation and that this was never meant to be a borrowing, this was explicitly what it was. We've seen the debate around their motive: is it pachad, is it fear, or is it chayin? And finally, we've seen a very beautiful thought by the Chemdat Yomim that this is compensation for the women, particularly because of their sacrifices that we've made. The final point I want to make is that the Rambam, it talks about a healing process as they leave Egypt and the 40 years as a traumatized nation emerging from the trauma of slavery. And I think we've discussed this in other settings, the views of the Rambam around the slow development of morality and other things. The pasuk really indicates this. At the beginning of next week's Parsha, they can't leave Egypt straight away. They have to go on a more lengthy, they can't go on a quick route because they'll be challenged. They have to go on a lengthier route in order to uncover. And certainly part of what's going on over here, according to the thinking of Rav Hirsch and other ideas, is that, and Rav Srotskin perhaps also, because he speaks about this, is that this is a healing process, a process of downtrodden people realizing they have rights, We didn't have to work for Egypt for nothing. We're entitled to our nakah. It's not when a victim receives compensation, it's not just monetary compensation, it's a restoration of dignity. And also this idea of Hash's idea that they need financial resources. And that part of maturation is recognizing actually we need money in order to do things, and therefore we're entitled to compensation. These are a range of, I think if you add it up, 8 different approaches to what the she'elah, the justification for the she'elah was. Yes?
Is there a reason why it says children would be the ones who can carry it?
I didn't come across anything, no. I don't know why. I'm not sure. I was thinking maybe it's indicating that this is not that important to them. That even though they need the wealth, it's relatively insignificant, and that's why they have the children. There is a Dubna Magid that comments on this Rashi that says that that my problem is that Avram. The Medrash that Rashi cites is very difficult because Rashi says that Hashem says to Moshe, please ask them to ask for wealth, because otherwise Avram will have complaints. You kept the slavery and you didn't keep the Rosh Gadol. The question is, only because of Avram's complaints, Hashem doesn't have to keep his word. Hashem promised they would leave Rosh Gadol. So the Magid says that the Rosh Gadol really is, as per other thoughts of Chazal, the great wealth of the Torah that they left with. What Hashem is saying to Avram is they'll go into slavery, but they will leave with great resources, spiritual resources from this. However, the Jewish people, weren't able to recognize these great spiritual resources. And therefore Avram is saying to Hashem, you're letting them down, because from their perspective, they haven't received anything. And the analogy he gives is of a child who is promised by a much loved uncle who comes to visit from abroad. He's going to give him a great gift. And at the end of the uncle's trip, the child's waiting with eager anticipation, and the uncle takes out his checkbook and writes him out a check for £10,000 and presents it to the kid, who bursts into tears because they've just been given a piece of paper and there's no way of understanding. So uncle sees this, puts his hands in his pocket and takes out 5 penny coins, shiny penny coins, and gives it to the kid. And the kid walks off delighted with the great wealth his uncle has given him. He says this is an analogy of the again, this idea of maturation and a sort of learning coming on. So he says that's what's going on over here. That the wealth really is insignificant. It's not the real Rosh Gadol that was spoken about. The real Rosh Gadol is the Torah, but at this point they need the more superficial Rosh Gadol in order to be able to appreciate it. So says the Magid.
At the beginning, you mentioned there were textual and moral questions, and also historical. I'm not sure that.
No, so I've left for today partly because of my time, and maybe I'll use it for another day. When did this event actually? Take place? If you look in the sources, all I highlighted from the Rishonim was a discussion about the morality about it. If you look in the sources, they also talk about when this took place, and there are Rishonim that think that took place. Rav Harsh actually says this. He says that whilst Moshe is in the court of Paro negotiating the last makkah, the Jewish people are out there asking the neighbors for wealth. An amazing idea.
Did some suggest that during the plague of darkness,
Rashi said during the plague of darkness they spy out, but they don't take. Yeah. The other textual thing I didn't go into is I alluded to it a couple of times is what the phrase V'nitzaltem, they will empty out. V'nitzaltem is Mitzrayim. Rav Harsh again speaks about this. Who is doing the looting or the emptying out or the despoiling? The simplest reason we have of the pasuk is the Jews emptied out the land of Egypt. Rav Harsh argues that if you follow through carefully the pronouns, you will see it means that the Egyptians are handing over their wealth. It's the Egyptians are this idea of Rashi that they're voluntarily giving even more that's being asked. It's the Egyptians that are emptying out the land of Egypt. That's what he claims as well. It means, and if you look at the Rishonim I spoke about, Rashi understands it from emptying out. The Ibn Ezra understands it as Hatzolah, it's a rescue. And other states misnutzel, it's like forgiveness or compensation. Again, in modern Hebrew, mitnutzel means I apologize. So it's an apology gift. And again, if you look at the Mefarshim that I printed, you'll see these 3 different reasons of an Nitzaltim. But I realized as I was giving the share that it would be confusing if I kept on jumping backwards and forwards. So I just focused on the word she'elah. But in parallel, there's a debate about when this happens, and also parallel about how to translate the word Nitzaltim. The Jews empty out, or the Egyptians empty out? Is it Hatzolah, a redemption and a saving? Or is it a compensation? It may mean the literal meaning of the words is lihit nutzel, to compensate or to make up. So those are different sense of what the pasuk means. Good evening. Anyway, I think it's fascinating. I hope you can see why I enjoyed preparing this. It's just a wealth of resources and ideas in pasukim. Yeah. Okay. Have a good evening. Thank you so much for everyone who joined.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Zobin.
Thank you very much. Thank you as always.